2, 1. Order. Order. Well, we welcome everybody to the second Environmental Audit Committee meeting. I'm very pleased to be joined by Professor Piers Forster, the Interim Chair of the Climate Change Committee, and Dr. James Richardson, who's previously the Acting Chief Executive, recently relieved of the Climate Change Committee. Very pleased also to have guesting with us today Bill Esterson, who's the Chair of the Energy Security and Net Zero Committee, and the other members of the Environmental Audit Committee. If I could make a start, firstly to Professor Forster, just invite you to introduce yourselves, and we will get on to into the session.
Yes, so excellent to be here today. So I'm the Interim Chair of the committee, and of course, as you know, it's our job to both advise Parliament and Government on how the government are doing, and in particular, we just advised on the NDC target, and we're about to advise government on the 7th carbon budget.
Wonderful. And Dr. Richardson?
And I'm James Richardson. I'm the Director of Analysis at the Climate Change Committee, and as you said, Chair, until a couple of weeks ago, I was the Acting Chief Executive. Fantastic.
And obviously, as we're aware, the Professor Forster's been in the role of Interim Chair for really quite a long time. Can you just explain, Dr. Richardson, why it was so long, and any impacts that had having an interim chair for such a long period of time?
So the appointment is made by the 4 governments of the UK, so the lead responsibility with the Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero of the UK government, but in agreement with the devolved nations. So it is their process, as it were, rather than ours. As I understand it, they have tried twice to get that process to conclude, but have not found a candidate that all 4 governments would agree to. So it is now back in their hands to find a candidate. Obviously, you have changed the personnel, that may make it easier to reach agreement. In terms of the impact on our work as an institution, I would say that, thanks to Piers for stepping up, we have been able to continue unaffected by this. I don't think Piers has been unaffected by it, having to do, 2 jobs. But for us as an institution, we're able to kind of continue working under this setup. And thankfully, the terms of the Act mean that, this doesn't affect our kind of decision making. But obviously, it would be great if, now that we have a new government, they can get on and hopefully find a candidate who is agreeable to all 4 nations.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that sort of period of time, whilst accepting what you're saying about it hasn't made a difference to what you're doing, has made a difference to how your work is perceived, or your ability to the way it is sort of you're able to operate? Do you think it's made a difference in that regard? How urgent do you think it is that government gets on with actually making a decision on this?
So I would hope it hasn't impacted on our ability. We're still producing the statutory reports, making our advice, making our case, appearing in front of bodies such as this. And there's certainly no sense from the governments with whom we interact that, they feel any different in their relationship with us. But I think, it is a kind of a question of good governance.
Yeah.
And the Act provides duties on the governments to appoint somebody to this, and it is their responsibility to be compliant with that. So we would certainly hope that is something that can be expedited. I appreciate the government has a lot on its plate, but it would be great to move that forward.
Thank you. Now, the Prime Minister announced at COP29 earlier this month that the UK's 2035 NDC would commit to reducing territorial emissions by 81% against the 1990 targets baseline, in line with the advice that your committee had provided. To what extent do you believe that, how far do you think this goes towards re-establishing the UK as a climate leader internationally, Professor Forster?
Yes, well, kind of when we took our advice into consideration, the first thing we did was to look at what is the right level of ambition to try to make a contribution to keeping temperatures to in that 1.5 degree target, and just as well as kind of re-evaluating where we are with the climate science, which is my own area of expertise. We did also very much look at the deliverability of that 81% target, and to do that effectively, we brought the analysis that we will publish at the end of February, the CB7 work, and that does re-evaluate where we have got to as a society and the current economic situation, but it also looks at where we have got to with the different technological options across the economy for decarbonising. But we did put a lot of work into it, and we'll be absolutely delighted to come back in February to talk to you about it in detail. But we put a lot of work into having a look at the economic implications and the implication on jobs and things as well. And we're quite confident that if we get this acceleration of delivery, it is a deliverable target, and we can do it in a way that is good for jobs and is cost effective as well.
And to what extent, Dr. Richardson, will individual behavioural change be needed if the country was to actually achieve those targets that the Prime Minister set out?
So within our analysis, and without kind of providing all the CB7 analysis that will come out in February, but in terms of the analysis that we have done prior to that, it's about 10% of the emissions reduction to 2035, the year for the NDC, comes from what we would think of as behaviour change. That's predominantly around diets, flying and modal shift in public transport, though there are smaller things in there. That's on our pathway. I think it is important to recognise that we provide advice on the level of carbon budgets and on the NDC. We set out, as it were, how we think that would be achieved and what our feasible, cost-effective pathway would be for that. But it is the government's decision as to how it seeks to achieve that. And of course, if the government wishes to do it with a different mix of policies, that is their choice to make.
In terms of what you're setting out at this moment in time, in terms of those three key areas, if they followed the approach you were talking about, what do you think would be the key behavioural changes that people would notice if they followed the path that you are suggesting?
So I think inevitably, of course, it varies a lot between different people. I mean, these are averages across the population, and one of the things that is important for us in the work we do is to recognise that different people have different abilities to respond to these things. And so, the Carbon Budget 6 analysis was based around the Citizens' Assembly that I believe this committee and other committees sponsored. We've also done a citizens' panel as part of the Carbon Budget 7 analysis. So, some people would go further and other people would go less far. In terms of kind of modal shift, we think the key thing there is basically provision of better public transport options so that people can choose different modes. I mean, it's something you see in this city because there is excellent public transport. A very high proportion of journeys are on public transport or people walking and cycling. But you see much less of that in a lot of other parts of the country, where if you compared the public transport option in, say, Leeds to a similarly sized city in Europe, there would be quite a big difference in provision. So you can make quite a big change by things like that. In terms of diet, we think about half of the change that you would need to get to by 2035 is just a continuation of the existing trends of people changing what they eat. And actually, if you took the trends from the last few years, just the last kind of 2 or 3 years, and rolled that forward, that rate would deliver all the change we need. But there may be a kind of cost of living effect in there that may not be a kind of trend. In terms of flights, it's really about the rate of growth. So it's not about saying to people, you must stop flying, but it is about saying the rate of growth of flights that we think would happen if you didn't take any action here is not consistent with our pathway. So we would see a lower rate of growth. And again, that's something that when we talk to citizens, that people seem very willing to accept that, yes, there must be kind of some degree of constraint here.
I mean, that all sounds pretty benign. A lot of what we've been reading has suggested that to get, countries got to 50%, getting on to this next target is very ambitious. It's going to require substantial behavioural change. I would say in terms of the difference between public transport here and in constituencies like mine in Derbyshire, it's not just that there's greater public transport provision, it's also so bloody impossible to drive around London that you're kind of forced onto cars. You can drive around Chesterfield much more easily. And so, to what extent, Professor Forster, are people going to, particularly in terms of the local transport, going to be expected to make substantial changes to their life? Or do you think, like Dr. Richardson, that it sort of isn't so much to expect from people for us to be able to get there?
Yeah, well, if you do look at our report, it is more about enabling our citizens to be able to make green choices. And I do think this is really why we encourage government to try and make just and fair policies to really make these choices affordable and easy. And I think particularly with the cost of living crisis we're in today, you do have to try and make it easy for consumers to do the right thing, basically. And this is why, if you look at the progress report we published in June, in fact, our very top recommendation in that report was to reduce the price of electricity, because if you can reduce the cost of electricity, you will make it more compelling for people to go out and buy an electric car, for people to install an air source heat pump rather than a gas boiler, and also for our industries to make the necessary investment in electrification. So I think what we are encouraging government to do, and what we're doing a lot of with our carbon budget advice, we're trying to look at the way different policies affect different parts of society, and what we would like to see as a committee is some really effective communication from government to try and enable us all to make the right choices, really. So I think it's not really about trying to tell people what they must do and what they can't do. It's about trying to really make the alternatives as easy as possible.
Thank you. John Whitby.
Thank you. Good afternoon to both of you. The 81% emission reduction from 1990 levels by 35 2035 is the equivalent of a 60% emission reduction from 2023 levels to be delivered in just 11 years. So I suppose the obvious question is this achievable, given the difficulty the UK's already had in reducing emissions levels in key sectors such as transport, buildings and agriculture?
Do you want me to have a go at that? I think the process of emissions reduction, I think it is important to understand, is not a kind of straight line. What happens is we are basically, not all of it, but predominantly what we are doing is replacing kind of embedded fossil fuel technologies, which are actually not terribly efficient, but we're all kind of used to, with fundamentally more efficient, predominantly electric technologies. But when those technologies are new, they're very expensive. So, you know, if you roll back 10 years and look at the price of an electric car, or, you know, if you roll back 20 years and look at the price of a solar panel, these things were extremely expensive. That's true of nearly all technologies when they arrive. A mobile phone cost £9,000 in the 1980s, right? The process then is one where by deploying those, you get learning by doing benefits, and the prices come down. And at some point, you reach a point where it is cost effective, regardless of kind of government incentives and so on, to deploy those technologies. We are now at that point with renewable electricity. We're basically within touching distance of that point on electric vehicles. We're further away on some of these other technologies. Once you hit that point, take up with any technology typically rises very sharply. It's termed an S-curve. So you shouldn't expect to see these things happen in a kind of linear way. As long as we can hit those inflection points in the S-curve that get you onto the steep bit, you should be able to do a lot. Now, I certainly don't want to underestimate the challenge here, right? I mean, getting to that point, bringing all these technologies through, industry changing their way that they provide heat and so on. There's a lot to be done. But I think, you know, we do see these pathways as realistic. We do a lot of effort to kind of model what we've seen in previous transitions, what countries that are further ahead than us have achieved in terms of change, you know, rates of change of take-up and so on. So it is underpinned as far as it is possible with our best evidence.
So without transgressing on other questions, do you see some of those quick progress to be made in things like agriculture and buildings?
So I think those are two more difficult sectors, because we are not yet at that point where the new technologies are cost effective compared to the old technologies. So you do need more support from the government. I think particularly on buildings, the key thing is this point about the price of electricity. We've seen in a lot of similar countries to us, like the Netherlands and France, that if you get the combination of upfront support, which we do now have, and the price ratio of electricity to gas being such that it's cost effective to run a heat pump, then actually you do see really rapid take-up, and we are seeing that in a lot of other countries. But we haven't got that electricity-gas price ratio right yet, and so it's more difficult here.
Okay. And can I just finally ask, what was the basis for the recommendation for the 81% emissions reduction? Why 81%?
Decided that, well, yes, so the first thing we have to look at our obligation as a country on the international stage, and under the Paris Agreement we have signed up to. So and that does basically tell us, because of our kind of historic contribution to climate change, we have got to be as ambitious as possible, kind of within the confines of what is deliverable in a cost-effective way. So that's the sort of benchmark we are working to, and we have to have one that does go through the existing legislated targets as well. So that 81% is perfectly consistent with the CB6 advice that was legislated by Boris Johnson's government. So that is what is set there. And that 81% benchmark is completely consistent with that. So we are not we are not really asking the country to do anything different than it already kind of signed up to do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Julia Buckley, please.
Thank you. So we were anticipating that early next year your committee will be providing that advice to the government on the level that you'll set the 7th carbon budget, so that overall limit for UK emissions from 38 to 42. Now, you've already mentioned this morning that you expect it at the end of February 25, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and you kindly offered that you would be willing to come back. So we'd just like you to confirm that you will come back to this committee and present the main findings of that advice.
We'd be delighted.
Yeah, we'd be really happy to do that.
Okay,
Plus, we also think it's a really important thing to do as well, because we do need that parliamentary scrutiny of our advice.
And it is ultimately you who set the budget.
Well, I'm afraid that brings me on to my next question, which is what would be the benefit to Parliament and the public if ministers publish that draft delivery plan for the carbon budget before asking both houses to set that overall limit in law? So it's just about that sequencing, isn't it?
Perhaps I can take that one. Yes, I do think that would be a really good idea to do that, but just because then you would be setting the carbon budget on your own pathway, kind of rather than the committee pathway. So I think that is a good idea, personally.
And yourself, sir?
No, I mean, I totally agree. I think, the more information in the sense that is available to you at the point when you're making that vote, clearly the better. And, we provide advice, but ultimately the government has to decide its pathway. As you say, it would have to be a draft, because if Parliament voted a different level of the number than the one that they had based their draft on, they would need to come back and revisit. But I think knowing that this is how they would propose to deliver it will give Parliament full information at the point when you have to take that vote. It's a lot of work for our colleagues in government, but I think it's part of the reason why we want to provide this early, is to allow that to take place.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Ellie Jones.
Thanks. It's good to meet both of you. Thank you for being here. So you publish lots of very useful reports. Thank you for your July 2024 report to Parliament on progress on emissions reductions. I'd just like to start by kind of inviting you to sort of summarise really how the picture has changed since your June 23 report, so perhaps over the last kind of 12 to 15 months. How has the picture changed in terms of where we are with greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular which of the sectors not on track are causing you most concern?
Do you want me to have a go?
Yeah, you start, and perhaps I can come chip in and go.
Yeah. So I think that there is quite a lot of good news. It is important to remember. The UK has met all three of the first carbon budgets. That's new since the previous progress report, and we have halved our domestic emissions, so there has been a lot of progress. 2023 was also a good year for emissions reduction. If we continued at that rate, we would hit our targets. But we are concerned that some of the reasons for that good progress probably won't last. So part of it is almost certainly to do with the very high cost of gas at the moment, and that will have suppressed demand. And part of it is due to the interaction with the electricity market, that in 2022 the French nuclear fleet went offline. We produced electricity by burning gas in the UK and sending electricity to France. In 2023 the fleet came back on, and so you kind of got 2 years of electricity progress in 2023 instead of seeing it split across the 2 years. So we are worried that that underlying rate of progress is not strong enough, particularly outside of the electricity supply sector. Electricity has really been the kind of hero sector of this, as renewables have pushed off, particularly coal, but also some gas. But of course, we've now closed the last coal-powered power station. I always get the wrong way around. So although there is still progress to be done on electricity, and it does provide about a quarter of the reduction in our pathway to 2030, we do now need to see a real acceleration of that progress. And I would say particularly buildings and surface transport industry and agriculture, particularly around things like tree planting, which have a very long lag. So it takes a long time for a tree to put on weight, if you like. So if you don't start soon, you don't get the benefits downstream. So there is a need to really accelerate across a wide range of sectors.
Thank you. I mean, we'll follow up, I think, with some of those specific sectors. I'd like to dig in particularly to the surface transport sector. I mean, there's any number of telling graphs, but one of them is on page 22 of your report, which shows that surface transport is, you know, the biggest sector. It's the most problematic sector. It's been the stickiest sector. The reduction in emissions from that sector has been, I think, less than 2/3 of what was predicted 15 years ago. So, and this is in the news today. So why has the reduction in that sector been less than was predicted, planned for, hoped? And what can be done to alter this trend?
So I think it's a combination of different things. I think one of the effects that we didn't expect is that the size of cars has got larger. So although petrol cars, diesel cars have become more fuel efficient for any given size of car, people have then started buying bigger cars, and that's undone a lot of the effect that we thought would happen, as it were, early in the transition about greater efficiency of the vehicle fleet. In a sense, we're now moving past that as a kind of main driver into electrification. And so the key issue now for us is the rate of take-up of electric vehicles. We are below where we had hoped to be, but some of that is that the overall vehicle market is smaller than we expected it to be. And that's almost certainly linked to the cost of living crisis and also some lingering effects from COVID, where obviously vehicle sales were very low for a period. Now, you know, that's very difficult for the vehicle industry, and we're seeing challenges there. They're finding that the overall market that they're selling into is suppressed because of these effects. Hopefully, though, that market will return. That is what we've seen in the past when car, van markets have been suppressed by economic circumstances, is that they do typically come back. And then when it comes back, it'll be coming back in a market where actually electric vehicles are more developed, where there are more models on sale, where those prices are lower. We do expect to see price parity within those new vehicle markets within the next few years, based on the falls in battery price that we are seeing. We're already now beginning to see price parity in the second-hand market, which of course is where most people buy their cars. So there is scope for a kind of rapid takeoff there. But undoubtedly the last year has been difficult. It's been difficult for manufacturers. And we have seen a kind of pause in the take-up. That does seem to have accelerated back again in the last 2 or 3 months. So it does feel like there's coming back, but we definitely saw from about last October and through until kind of July that sales were basically pretty flat. And it's difficult to know exactly what's going on with that. Some of it will be cost of living. You know, you can easily put off a purchase. Some of it will probably be that people can see that, well, if I wait a year or two, there'll be new models coming in and they'll be even cheaper. And so ironically, as it were, a falling price can sometimes lead you to delay a decision. It's also possible that there is an effect from the reversals we saw under the previous government on the timing of the phase out for petrol and diesel vehicles. I can't point to any direct evidence that kind of shows that, but the timing certainly is a kind of coincidence around that of when sales slowed down. We do think that should come back as prices fall. You know, the electric vehicle is inherently a much better car. It's much cheaper to run, it's just cheaper to maintain, it's quieter, it's easier to drive, you don't have to go to the petrol station to fill it up. You know, obviously there are issues around charge points in some parts of the country, so it's not, you know, we're not 100% of the way there yet, but it is inherently a much better piece of technology. And as the upfront price falls, you would expect to see people taking them up. I should also say we've recently seen a campaign by the SMMT to try and bust some of the myths out there. And I think that's a really great initiative from the industry to try and get over some of the misinformation that there is around electric vehicles. So really welcome that from the industry.
Thank you. Could I ask you about 2 specific kind of policy levers? I mean, in the news today, we have, you know, some parts of the industry are putting pressure on government in relation to the zero emission vehicle mandate, which your report is very clear about being a very important policy lever. So would you care to make any comment on that particular policy? And the second one is around charging infrastructure, which you referred to there. Again, your report says that, you know, we're on track for rollout, but it's got to treble over the next few years. One of the hesitations that the general population have about shifting to EVs is around the infrastructure. So are you seeing signals in the right direction from government on that? What more is needed to ensure that the charging infrastructure is there to support the development of the market?
So I think these are both really important issues in the rollout of electric vehicles. In terms of the ZEV mandate, I mean, we do support this. It's introduced by the previous government about a year ago. I think the key thing about it actually is that it's a smart piece of industrial policy. You know, we know from previous transitions between technologies that incumbent firms can get left behind. You know, we all remember kind of Blockbuster Video or Kodak, right? When these new technologies come in, it can be easy for incumbents to think they have more time to change than they do. And the zero emission vehicle mandate is actually a way of saying to industry as much as anything, look, actually you have less time than you think. And I think it is important to say, you know, when we talk to the industry, that they are very supportive of this transition. I think what they're asking for is kind of a bit more flexibility around some of the timing, because perhaps the transition is taking place just slightly more slowly than we had hoped. As I say, we've had this kind of lull. But actually they do look like, for the car market, they are actually on track for this year, the kind of 18% which using the flexibility. Vans are much more challenging, which I think does take you on to charging infrastructure. Though I would be remiss if I didn't also reflag up the point about making electricity cheaper. I mean, that pulls the demand, because the industry are rightly talking about the demand, and that's a key factor. But I think particularly for vans, access to charging infrastructure, grid connections, these are things, they're very much on the government's plate. But you know, we really do need to see progress on that, unblocking that grid queue, so that people who want to put in a substation in order to be able to put a van fleet on to charge overnight or whatever it might be, that those people can act quickly. Because you know, we hear a lot of stories from people who are trying to do the right thing, firms that are trying to move to electric transport, and you know, if it's a van fleet or a lorry fleet, they just can't access the grid, so there is a blocker there. I think on the household and cars side, actually we are seeing the rates of increase on those charges that we need to triple it. You have to kind of assume it's a compound process, but we do think it will be. So if it increases by a third each year and multiplies through, you should see that, and that's what we would expect. But you know, there are particular issues. So just to give an example, where I live, there are charge points in all the lampposts. It's very important for people who don't have off-street to be able to access low-cost overnight charging rather than just rapid charging. But you know, where I live is not where everybody lives, and lots of parts of the country don't have the same level of infrastructure available. So there are things there, and that can be a role for local governments who often own that accesses. There's power in the lamppost already. So it's a relatively easy thing to convert. And doing those kind of measures, which are relatively simple, can help give people confidence. Because if you don't have a driveway, and it's only about 30% of people, but if you don't have a driveway, you don't want to have to drive off to the expensive charger or try and find somewhere. You want it to be on the street where you would park anyway. So there are some quite straightforward things that could make quite a big difference there, and it'd be great to see those accelerations.
Okay, just on that, you're suggesting that the infrastructure is broadly on target, but the amount of demand amongst the public needs to treble. I think many people listening to what you were just saying there would think that was quite a rosy picture in terms of, you don't have to go to a petrol, you have the inconvenience of going to a petrol station, you just have to find somewhere we can sit by the side of the road for half an hour. Clearly, public demand is still a significant issue, and it's going to get harder the lower you down the demographic groups you go. You know, if you're living in a terraced property without a drive, if you're living in a council flat, it's very, very difficult for you to access this. Do you not think that it gets harder with each? I appreciate what you said about the technologies and prices, but some of those the kind of issues with public demand, it feels to me like you're somewhat underestimating the barriers, and why much of the industry is who I absolutely agree are on board in terms of the target, in terms of the ambition, but are very worried about the stepping up of the target. We've obviously seen that in terms of vans with Vauxhall today. You know, do you not think you're underestimating the difficulties in terms of public demand? Sorry.
Yeah, well, perhaps you've been answering fantastic, James, but I'll give a bit of time off now. So I think when we do our analysis, we really try and look at what is realistic delivery rates with where we are currently, where industry currently, what government policies are in place currently, and what are the public attitude currently. And we try and look within that what sort of government policy will be necessary to do that acceleration we all want to try and achieve. And real couple of things I think we need to have a look at with this. The really first is about these long-term consistent policies that are really well communicated. They have to be both communicated by the industry and communicated by the government as well. So you have to really keep that consistent messaging out there, that in the long term your electric car will not be as expensive for you as the petrol and diesel one you're using currently. So that's the first thing. And the other thing I think is to really try and work as much as possible with industry to become advocates for the change we're undertaking. So that is why we think as a committee that the ZEV kind of mandate is really that effective policy to be able to see the changes. But I think you're right there, Ellie, that the one we're concerned about are plans, and we're looking at particularly the SME type kind of businesses, and that is where I do think it would be good to have a look at what are the kind of support policy there to really give the SMEs the confidence to get out and get an electric van.
Thank you. Chris Hinchliffe.
Thank you, Chair. And good afternoon, gentlemen. To think in general terms about where we're off track and on track for delivery, we've heard just now about where we're off track is in part because of some of the assumptions in our thinking not being borne out in the long term, you know, around the weight of cars, for example, and some of the efficiencies and how that then plays out. So just quickly to start with, how vulnerable are we to our underlying assumptions being off in reaching our long-term targets?
So I think part of the structure of the Climate Change Act is these 5-year carbon budgets, and that does mean that, you know, if one assumption goes one way, another assumption goes another way, or if you get kind of noise in the system, is, you know, like the French nuclear example I gave you, then over a 5-year period that should balance out within the carbon budget. So the system is designed to be able to kind of deal with some of that uncertainty. But we also think it is important for the government to have a kind of set of contingencies against its own plan to say, well, look, this is what we think will happen. Here are the policies we're going to put in place to make that. But actually, this is what we will do if we find ourselves off track, because that clearly could happen.
Okay, thank you. And so within your 2024 report, you set out 10 priority actions, which cover a number of areas. Would delivery of those actions be sufficient to set us on track to achieve the 6th carbon budget? And just to follow that up with a few other quick questions, we've obviously not got much of 2024 left at this point in time. Are there gaps in the delivery of those 10 priority actions If so, which are the most serious gaps, and what are the implications of those gaps remaining?
Shall I have a go?
Yeah, I'll go first.
So I think the first thing I'd say is that the 10 recommendations are the things that we saw as most important, but that's not the sum of everything that needs to be done to get back on track. It's the things that we saw that the government could most urgently do. We will have more to say on the rest of it, as it were, when we publish the 7th carbon budget. In terms of what hasn't been done from that list, I mean, we keep banging on about it, but this point about making electricity cheaper is the top recommendation for a reason, and we haven't yet heard anything from the government on that. So I would focus on that. But there are other things around, more help for industrial electrification. Now, I think, to be fair, we had an announcement only a few days ago on one of the things in that list around the planning rules around heat pumps. So, there is progress. We are expecting the government's response to our progress report before Christmas, and that should set out and hopefully will trigger more actions on those recommendations. But in a sense, that's to them. I would say we are seeing quite a bit of progress, but we do still need quite a lot more.
Yeah, and perhaps to just come back to those 10 recommendations, those 10 recommendations were particularly designed to get that 2030 target, to try and get that CB6 target, that 2035 timeline. There are some additional things we need to see there. We begin to need to see the scaling up of the electricity kind of supply there to cope with the extra demand. And the other thing we need to do, we need to begin to see the rollout of carbon dioxide removal technology as well. So there are some additional things to get to that path.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Barry Gardner.
Thank you. If I can just pick up on the electric vehicles for a bit. In your July report, you said that you highlighted the need to increase electric vehicle sales from 16.5% of new car sales in 23 to between 80 and 100%, and for vans from 5.9%, reinforcing what you just said about vans, to between 70 and 100% by 2030. And you say that the slowdown in growth in the UK coincided with the decision to delay the 2030 phase-out date taken by the previous Prime Minister. So what is your view about the potential impact of a further change in the ZEV regime, and how that might impact upon the clarity, the certainty? I think you spoke, Professor, about the consistency of policy that business needs in order to plan its production lines well in advance.
Yeah, I do not think it's the job of our committee to comment on currently what is a very hot kind of political debate of the hour, and this is particularly the government policy as well. So it's not our policy, it's government policy.
I was merely picking up on what you said in your report.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What we say in our report are these long-term, consistent policies are the best way to both give business confidence, but also give that consumer confidence that if they go out and buy an electric car, they aren't making a stupid purchase. So I think I'm just going to stop at that.
I think we've both made the point. Yes, thanks very much. Look, Professor Forster, you founded the Priestley Centre for Climate Futures, and
wow.
I know you don't claim to be Nostradamus, but your ability to project into the future the impact of climate change is what I want to turn to now. Because the title of this inquiry is Delivering the Government's Climate Targets. those targets are not just in emissions reduction, though most of our questioning today has been about that. They're also for a country that is resilient to climate impacts, and that is adaptation rather than mitigation. So we're a signatory to the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction. Article 7 of the Paris Treaty establishes a global goal on adaptation to enhance our adaptive capacity, strengthen our resilience, reduce our vulnerability. So it's these goals I want to ask you about, because in March you published your independent assessment of the third National Adaptation Plan, which the previous government had produced in July of last year. So I'm going to ask you to set out for us the key findings that you made, what you think would be good recommendations for this committee to include to ensure that those targets, our adaptation targets, are going to be met.
Well, okay, perhaps I can start with that. So I absolutely think it's good to talk about why we're asking the country to reduce its emissions, and that is because we want to kind of protect our own population and the rest of the world as well from the impacts of climate change. And I think with the very wet weather we're seeing today, that is an example. And I think we are beginning to get a bit of a kind of cognitive kind of dissonance between what we're asking people to do to kind of why we're kind of doing it. So I'd always like to make sure we understand kind of why we're asking our society to transition.
It's to avoid Storm Bert. It's to avoid the flooding that we've just seen. And I think you're right. We don't often see that connection being made when people are asking us about, should we continue with this policy or should we backtrack?
But you're absolutely right. But just because we are going to always have a lot of climate change to cope with, we have to adapt our society. And I just concentrate on one key piece of advice that we are going to be producing. So toward the end of next year, I can't remember when, James can tell me, we're going to be publishing a report on well-adapted UK. And that's precisely what you talk about, because we don't currently have really clear adaptation targets. You talk about adaptation because of targets, but I think the most important thing we can do there is actually try and define what a well-adapted UK would be like. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think that is the kind of, if you said what was our top ask in that response on that, which I think, it'd probably be fair to say was not entirely complimentary on that.
Well, I think you said NAT3 lacks the pace and ambition to address the glowing climate risks which we're already experiencing in the UK. You talked about slow progress. It's damning. Yeah. It's absolutely damning.
And I think what we would say at the top is that the first thing we have to do as a country is work out, as it were, what is the level of adaptation that we are seeking to achieve? What are our kind of quantifiable goals? And then, what are the actions that sit behind that? And how are we going to measure it? Obviously, you then have to do those things. But you start by working out what it is that you are trying to achieve, how you are going to try and achieve it, and how you will measure progress. And that seems pretty basic, right? But we don't have those things in place.
Well, let me start, because you were the chief economist at the National Infrastructure Commission. So can you explain to the committee what's required to meet the resilience standards for our national infrastructure? Which parts of our critical infrastructure, our power supplies, our hospitals and so on, are actually currently at risk given the projections that you see for the future? And IPCC says that we're on course between 2.7 and 3.1, let's face it. So we need to be thinking about what resilience actually means for our critical infrastructure beyond 2050, and how our failure to adapt properly can impact on our mitigation efforts?
So, I mean, a lot of that, of course, is the work that we are doing for this well-adapted UK report, so we will have much more to say on that when that comes out. But I think it is clear that you're seeing very differential levels of adaptation action. So if I look at, say, drought, actually there has been quite a bit of action over the last few years, and I am going to claim some credit to the National Infrastructure Commission for its 2018 report on this. I think that has triggered a general recognition across government and the industry and the regulator on the level of action that is needed. So the kind of what needs to be done, both in terms of the quantified objective and the actual kind of measures underneath it. And although progress in building infrastructure in this country is glacial, there are things going on underneath that are beginning to see action on that. So I wouldn't say it's by any means a done deal, but it is a more encouraging position. Whereas I think on something like, say, flood protection, the Environment Agency are out there and their equivalents in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, building stuff. So I don't want to say nothing's going on. But actually, if you say, well, what is the level of flood protection that we are seeking to offer our citizens? There is no answer to that question.
Well, I think the answer may be provided by my colleague there, Sarah Gibson, whose constituencies just felt the impacts of it. But, I take the point. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Barry. Martin Rhodes.
You made reference earlier in passing in regard to heat pumps. In terms of heat pump installation rates are assessed as being, I think, significantly off track. In your view, what are the main reasons for this?
So I think top of the list is this point about the relative prices of electricity and gas. You've got to make it cost effective for a household to get one of these things. There's got to be a saving on bills. And that would be true if the true costs of electricity and gas were being reflected in the market prices. But at the moment, we add these extra costs onto electricity that distort that. So that, I think, is is that sense in which there's a pull from the user because they can see the benefit of it, and in which you're just kind of lining up. You're saying, look, actually, if you do the right thing, you benefit from it. At the moment, you do the right thing, you may lose from it. It's not a very good message to people. And that long-term, consistent demand that Piers talked about a second ago is really, really important, because that also then helps people move into the industry and think, well, actually, it's worth me training for this, for example. But that, I think, is a second issue here, that there are relatively few people who are trained in installation. Lots and lots of people who will install a boiler for you, relatively few who know how to install a heat pump. It's not that difficult if you're a trained boiler installer to do the cross-training. I mean, if you're starting from scratch as an apprentice, it's obviously a longer process. And we do see some companies that are now beginning to offer processes like apprentices. So there is action on it, but we're not seeing that pull through of enough people being with the skills. And then it's also, it can be quite difficult for a household. Now, thankfully, we've just seen this change on planning. It'll be interesting to see what effect that has. It comes in, I think, on the 1st of January. But, we have just been making it artificially difficult to install a heat pump, whereas you don't require any of that for a boiler. So there are challenges there. And I think it's one of those things where you've got to try and get all of these things right to make it easy and accessible for households. I would also point to the social rented sector and privately rented sectors, where you've got a mismatch between the person who's paying the bills and the person who's installing the heating system. And so you've got to work with those sectors, but also potentially kind of regulate, or maybe in the case of the social housing sector, you may need to subsidise as well, because you don't want that getting passed through to bills onto people who are on low incomes. So that those sectors also move. Something like the boiler upgrade scheme, it works for a householder because they get the saving on the bill if you get the prices right. But of course, the landlord bears the cost of the heating system and the tenant bears the cost of the bill. So you have to kind of line those things up as well.
You mentioned the issue around the availability of heat pump installers, and you also mentioned in terms of conversion training and also the possibility of apprenticeships. Should the principal focus be encouraging young people and apprenticeships and new people coming into this career path, or is it about retraining existing engineers?
I think it's probably both. You have a large stock of people who install boilers for a living and who can quite straightforwardly, as it were, cross-train. But many of those people are, I think I'm allowed to say this now, they're relatively older than my age. And they're probably not thinking that in the 2040s and 2050s they'll be installing heat pumps. So you also want to bring people in who are the workforce of tomorrow. And of course, this is potentially quite an attractive job. It doesn't require a university degree. We're very good as a country at university degrees. We're less good for people for whom that's not the natural route. It's not going to be replaced by AI. It's not going to be outsourced to a foreign country. And you get up every morning, you're doing something for society. I think that's quite an appealing prospect. Obviously, you need to make sure that there are good wages and conditions in those jobs. But I think it could be quite an attractive thing for young people, and it's everywhere. It's not just in London.
And in terms of heat pumps, what can we learn in the UK from elsewhere in the world in terms of where there maybe have been greater progress?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, the one advantage of being where we are on this is that we can learn more because almost every other country that we would look to is further down the road. I mean, it does mainly point to the things that we've already talked about. If you look at the countries where you're seeing big takeoff in heat pump rates, it is mostly that combination of getting the financial incentives right for people, making it relatively hassle-free, and having a kind of clear, consistent narrative and plan from government so that it's worth people's while making that switch, it's worth people's while training into the industry, it's worth businesses' while setting up in it. And the Scandinavian countries, where of course it's famously not very hot in winter, are the furthest advanced. But actually we're seeing real change in places like the Netherlands, which is very similar in terms of its kind of use of gas and so on to the UK. So this can be done. We are optimistic based on that evidence, but only if the pieces are put in place.
Thank you.
Bill Esterson.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks for asking me to take part as the Chair of the Energy Security Net Zero Committee. We have our own inquiry we're following up on our previous committee's inquiry into home heating. We have a session next week, so this is very timely, thank you. You were just talking about other countries. Why are they doing so much better than us? Is it about confidence? Is it this point around better communication? Or is it just electricity prices being lower?
I think it's the mix of these things. Yeah. I think, it is the electricity price thing. I think it would be the single biggest thing, but I wouldn't want to say, well, if you just set the price right, everything else magically falls in place. But, it is probably the thing that makes the most difference. If you look at, the chart of the kind of electricity to gas price ratio and the rate of heat pump take up, I mean, it's pretty much a straight line in the direction you'd expect. So it is a very important factor. But yeah, we do need to get these other things in place as well.
Yeah, and perhaps what I would say to that is that we do have a very, very bad track record in the residential building sector in particular. There's chopping and changing different policies where they're introduced and they're withdrawn and then they're changed. So I don't think that inspires exactly the same business or consumer confidence that we're seeing in other countries.
Do you think, from what you've seen of this government's warm homes plan, that there's going to be a greater degree of certainty and that's going to make a difference?
Touch wood.
Yeah. It's early days. That's what we would hope.
Yeah, we will, and we come back in July and tell you that.
Look forward to it. Thank you. And the previous government had a target of 600,000 heat pump installations a year. That we're doing about a tenth of it. Do you think that target is realistic, all things being equal?
It's extremely challenging. Yeah. I think, if you've got all the right things in place and you saw growth rates that are towards the top of what we have seen in other countries, and recognising that some of that 600,000 is new builds. So if you sure. prevent any new gas connections for any new properties that are built, which you ought to do, because it's madness to build a new house and connect it to the gas grid and then require the new... I think it would be a very sensible recommendation to make.
It
is not impossible to hit that target, but I would not want to underestimate how challenging that is.
Thanks very much. And I think in your report you talked about the supply chain, you talked about manufacturing. Again, how important is it that we have a strong domestic supply chain?
So I think the manufacturing side of it would be the thing that I was least worried about within heat pumps, simply because there is a global market in heat pumps that is quite large. Now, if you want that manufacturing base here, obviously, again, the stable long-term policy creating demand that makes it worthwhile for somebody to set up a factory here. And you start to get into questions of industrial policy that are perhaps at the limits of our remit. But can you source the number of heat pumps for houses that you need? I think that would be the thing I would be least worried about, because there are a lot of heat pumps around the world.
Great. And then I think this will be my final question. You've talked a lot about how expensive electricity is. You talked just now about the extra costs of electricity. So if they don't go on the electricity bills, where should those extra costs go?
So it's a choice for the government, but basically you can put it onto the gas bill, keeping the balance within the dual fuel bill, that's roughly where it is, or you can put it onto taxpayers. Obviously, the public finances are under strain, so we don't say that lightly. I think the government will need to decide on the balance between those things, and it may be that you want to have a bit of each. Partly because you do have it's a relatively small proportion, but there's about 15% of the population who aren't on gas. So of course they gain, and that's important because there's a lot of fuel poor households in that group. But then there's a cost of them gaining that has to sit somewhere. And you might want the Exchequer to pick up that part and then say, well, we'll equalise the impact on a dual fuel bill, but within that you've changed the relative prices and therefore the incentives and what happens if people switch. So there are definitely choices for the government to make on that balance. I think the other thing I would say that you do want to try and do alongside this, there will be some households who have very high gas bills and relatively low electricity bills. That almost certainly means that they've got either very large houses, in which case maybe we're not super worried about them, they can afford it, but very leaky houses. So you probably do want more effort on the insulation of those properties, because that's the best way of sorting out that part of the issue, rather than saying, well, we won't do it, is to say, well, look, we just need to stop those houses wasting so much.
So the importance of the fabric first approach. Of course, you've just advocated potentially putting extra. So I did say it was the last question. I wasn't telling the truth, of course. The importance of so if we move the levies off electric bills, but you also want us to get less gas. So that what happens there?
Yeah, so if you rebalance them between gas and electric, then of course you shift the incentive for people to stick with gas and create a better incentive for them to move onto electric. But as it were, your day one dual fuel bill can still be the same, because you've taken a cost off one side of that bill and put it onto the other side. And that's the kind of balance that is there now. So that balance does require some Exchequer funding to make it work. I wouldn't want to pretend it doesn't.
But ultimately, as we're using less gas and we want the same amount of levy collected from gas, that's going to be very expensive gas bills.
Fortunately, the levies themselves will naturally reduce over time. Quite a substantial element of them is from the early costs when renewables were very expensive a long time ago. Those are on fixed 15-year mostly contracts, so they will roll off. So that problem does thankfully solve itself.
It sorts itself out. Okay. No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Sarah Gibson.
Thank you. I was going to move on to agriculture, and I'm sure that Toby's organised this very well, because he knows that if I talked about heat pumps and air tightness on buildings, you'd never get me out of here. So probably a sensible thing. But I think this is quite important, because we are seeing these drops in terms of our energy use, because the decarbonisation of the grid is going better. But in fact, agriculture and land emissions seem to have been very slow to reduce. And we're interested to know what the biggest limiting factors are in your views. In your report back in 2024, one notes that there's a lack of policies that tackle emissions specifically in agriculture and land use. And why do you think this is the case, and what should we be looking at?
Well, because I have to declare interest. I'm actually a partner in a kind of family kind of farm as well. So in terms of what I really think the sector needs, probably first of all is a proper land use strategy to come from the government. This is something they have consulted on, but we have yet to see it produced. So I think producing that ought to really set a clarity over the overall direction of what sort of things you do in what part of the country and what sort of interventions you want to do. And the other sort of certainty is with the sort of government grant that will replace the Common Agricultural Policy, the so-called home grant coming out of TEFRA, and that has taken a very long time to come out, and the size of that grant and exactly what the kind of voluntary take up within that grant to deliver the sort of on-farm changes we want to see occur. That is all a bit confused currently, and we do need to see really good, clear guidance coming out of TEFRA about the sort of on-farm changes that can be introduced to try and decarbonise. And there's a lot of emphasis on all sorts of different things within those kind of subsidies, but the actual quantified thing that could actually reduce the carbon emissions of agriculture are more uncertain, and it's quite uncertain where the direct support for those policies to come from.
So are there any specific policies that you think that ministers should be adopting in the short term that would make a significant difference?
Just in terms of what we have discussed at the Climate Change Committee, what we are keen to see in the short term are policies for woodland creation and peatland restoration. They're particularly important ones to do early, but because as James talked about, trees take a long time to draw down carbon, so if we want them to affect our net zero 2050 target, those sort of tree planting does have to happen early. And quite a lot of the other sort of policies, I think, are really to try to bring in the helm grant and things as early as possible, and to give our kind of farming communities the right financial incentives to be able to change. I mean, it is a very subsidised industry. So what we do say to government, it ought to be able to use those subsidies to affect the right sort of changes.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Which just kind of brings me on to a slightly more specific area, which is...
Just before you move on, Sarah, I'll come back
Yeah.
to you in a moment. I'll just bring Barry in on this
Thank you very
issue
much.
and then I'll come on to you again.
Just interested in what you were saying about the tree planting being so important. Because we often talk about the right tree in the right place, but you were specifically talking about the time it takes for those trees to sequester carbon. So we can look at this from a biodiversity point of view, in which case we might go for mixed deciduous, traditional oak, elm, beech, and so on. But if you're looking at fast growth and sequestration of carbon, you might be looking at dreadful Sitka spruce. How do you balance those two things?
That is a very good point you brought up, because that is where our committee had changed our advice. So if you do look at our older reports, we talked about trying to grow your carbon as fast as possible, but that is our advice really had changed with that. So we're far more about trying to make sure we do plant the right trees in the right sort of place. In fact, and the good thing about that, these very high quality, very climate resilient, biodiverse woodlands can still sequester exactly the same amount of carbon as your standard conifers, but they just take more time to do it. So that is exactly why our recommendation is to put those trees in the ground as early as possible, because then it gives them the time to eventually sequester exactly the same amount of carbon.
Yeah. So the right tree in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll bring Cameron Thomas in and then we'll go back to Sarah to finish.
Fine.
Just following on from Barry's point there, the climate in the UK is changing and it's getting warmer, and many of the trees, flora that we're used to in this country, will now struggle to adapt to the climate as it warms. There is, of course, a concern around invasive species, but what sort of balance do you think the government should find in looking into flora that are actually not native to the UK, and how we might introduce those along the same lines?
That is a bit kind of beyond our expertise as a committee, but I know I'm also trustee of a kind of charity that does this, and we work in partnership with all organisations like the Woodland Trust and Capital England that do exactly take those things into consideration. So you don't put exactly the same trees in you would do today. You think about exactly what's the climatic conditions there could be in 20, 30 years' time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, back to you, Sarah.
Yes, sorry, this is slightly more specific and comes up from your report, which is to do with methane emissions, where the reduction rates in agriculture from your committee's recommendations for the balanced pathway need to almost increase by 8-fold. And can this be achieved, do you think, with the sort of current agricultural practices? Would methane suppression feed products alone have had that sort of potential to achieve the reductions on agricultural and methane, and if not, sort of what other things should we be considering?
Well, we will give you our complete advice when we publish our report at the end of February. And just to say, we do think we can be more optimistic about some of those on-farm changes. That is, if you do have a look at the evidence today, things like feed supplements and good animal husbandry and good genetics can in fact make a significant difference, but we're also quite clear in our advice that we aren't going to get the necessary methane reduction without a reduction in numbers of livestock as well. The reduction in livestock do two things. They do reduce the kind of methane emissions directly, but on top of that, they do to take some pasture land out of production, and with that pasture, you can put in your woodland and try and support other biodiversity and fishing and things.
Very much. Chris Hinchcliffe.
Thanks. So an important part of the evidence this afternoon has been around heat decarbonisation, and we've just had the autumn budget and seen some announcements in that relating to that point. So looking at the figures announced in the budget, would you say that the upfront support for incentivising heat decarbonisation and also the necessary parallel improvements in home insulation is about right?
So I think really we need to look to the spending review on this, because these are about long-term programmes. You know, the budget was very much around, a lot about tax, clearly. The spending side of the budget was kind of, here is 1 year to tide you over whilst we do a full spending review. And as somebody who's put together budgets and spending reviews in my past life, I understand why they've done it that way. But for what we are talking about, these are really kind of long-term programs, so really we need to see what the kind of longer term settlements are before I think we're able to say whether that's the right order of magnitude. I should say, as for the first time, I think, as part of our 7th carbon budget, we will be setting out the broad kind of range of where we think, depending on the choices that government wishes to make, the public spending implications of our pathway would be, because it's obviously a very contemporary topic at the moment. Now, there's a lot of choice for government within that, and we're not seeking to make those for them, but we're trying to kind of illustrate a little bit more than we've done in the past how you might do this in different ways within the public finances. So we'll have a bit more to say in the spring.
And given the importance that you've given this afternoon to electricity prices, again, you might give me the same answer here, but would the committee recommend any further fiscal measures for the government to consider in addressing the gas-electricity price ratio?
So I think it is in some senses a fiscal question. Your answer to that might be, actually, we're going to rebalance it all between electricity and gas, and there's no kind of taxpayer contribution, or it might be that there is an element of taxpayer contribution within that, but it's a question that has to be addressed within a kind of fiscal context. It wasn't in the budget. We are waiting, as I said, for the response to our progress report, so hopefully the government will set out both its views on that, and, as it were, if it is something that they seek to address through a spending review or some other process, that we would get clarity on when that would be. But I suppose I would certainly expect the Treasury to be around the table when that decision making is made.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Cameron Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. What level of acceleration of peatland restoration and tree planting do you think is necessary to meet emissions targets on the Climate Change Committee's balanced pathway?
I don't know if I remember all the exact numbers, but things need to dramatically accelerate. We recommend, for example, between 30,000 to 50,000 hectares of woodland does need to be put in annually, and I think we're somewhere, I can't remember exactly,
about 13,000.
Yeah, 13,000, somewhere about between 10 and 15,000, and we also need to see, I didn't know the peak numbers.
So we're about 12,700 hectares at the moment, and we need about 32,000.
Yeah.
So it's roughly slightly more than doubling in both cases.
Yeah. Triple or double. Yeah.
Thank you. Two parts to the next question, if you wouldn't mind. The government announced £400 million of funding for tree planting and peatland restoration in the budget. So firstly, to what extent do you think that is or is not adequate? And how should that spending be best apportioned to accelerate those activities to the levels required to contribute to emissions reduction?
So I fear I may be about to give you the answer I just gave your colleague, in the sense that this is a long-term programme, so really what we need are those long-term settlements. It's great that they've put money in, but it's a short-term thing because that's how they're doing spending. Actually, what we need is that long, because the trees take a long time to grow, because we need to manage these run rates over long periods of time. Similarly on peatland, these are not things that you can just do overnight. You need a programmatic approach. So that's what we would hope to see, is a longer-term, clearer plan from the government. And inevitably, that's a matter for the spending review. I don't think we were ever going to get that in the budget.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Olivia Blake.
Just a quick one on peatlands. Do you think there's a need for a look again at the ban on burning that was brought in under the last government to protect peatlands from further degradation, because it only covers areas of deep peat at the moment?
I think we'll be looking at peatland again quite carefully when we publish our CB7 advice. I think we thought it was a bit easier to restore than it is, and it takes more time and a bit more thought to do, especially on coal and peat. So I am afraid I do not have a particular answer to you, but we're going to have a brand new comprehensive look at peat when we publish in February.
Okay, thank you. My next question is again about the funding settlements that were announced by the Chancellor for 2025-26 to enable individual departments responsible for tackling climate change to deliver and sustain emission reductions at the pace required. Do you think that they are adequate or going in the right direction?
Apart from James,
yeah,
because he's an economist.
I mean, as I said before, I think what really matters will be the long-term programs. It was encouraging within the budget to see that change in the overall capital envelope. That hasn't been allocated yet, and obviously there's many competing demands on that. But I think seeing that, essentially a restoration of the plan that we had a few years ago, actually, on the capital budget that would, stop it falling. That's really important because this is an investment program first and foremost. So it's largely capital spending that matters, both private and public. So there's certainly a much more plausible envelope there for the kinds of things that we think need to be done. But I do appreciate there are many pressures on that, and we'll have to see what the kind of settlements come out in the spending review, but it's clearly a step in the right direction.
Under the last spending review, the Treasury were quite keen to see joint kind of applications to it. Do you think that would be of benefit in trying to reduce targets across government, meet targets across government, sorry?
I would certainly hope that between the departments that have responsibility here and also within the Treasury, that the spend on net zero and also the spend on climate adaptation are brought together. And that part of that process is saying, here is the total, does that line up with what we think we need to do to meet the government's targets? Does that line up with what we're trying to achieve in adaptation, rather than it purely being looked at department by department? I mean, the way the process works, they will end up with a departmental lens on it, but hopefully they're also capable of bringing that together in a joined up way. So I'd certainly hope that that's part of how they're doing it.
Okay, moving back to transport, just to focus on aviation, which is a big area for you, and to what extent is the UK relying on the net reduction in international aviation emissions to deliver its targets at the moment?
Perhaps I'll pick that up. So we have for a very long time recommended as a committee that both international aviation and shipping is included within our carbon budget. The government has said that they will include it within the sixth carbon budget, but that is we are still in fact waiting for that to be expressly delivered in kind of legislation. So, and that is a very important thing to do, because we have to get our country onto the right way to hit that net zero 2050 target, and it's too unfair to try and get those carbon budgets without a contribution that comes from our aviation industry. And what I think is very important as well is that we are really one of the most progressive countries trying to have a look at our aviation industry. And if you talk to the people in the industry, they actually want to try and work to this net zero target, just because they think they can influence the international negotiations. So I think by really incorporating with it in our carbon budgets, you do encourage the industry to really think about these innovative technologies and to really make the necessary investments as well. So I think it is something that is good for industry, and it is absolutely the right thing to do.
So it's encouraging to hear that the government are considering bringing in aviation and shipping emissions into Carbon Budget 6. If that wasn't to happen, what would the consequences be if aviation and shipping were to remain outside the 6th Carbon Budget envelope?
Well, yeah, it's what I really did say before. The I think then that would mean that other areas of the economy would have to finance 13 million tonnes of decarbonisation or something like that. So you have to get that coming from the aviation industry, really.
Great, that's really useful. I was looking for that number, so thank you for that. I think that's all, Chair.
Thank you very much. Let's bring Chris Hinchliffe in.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, to return to recent announcements, could I tempt you to comment on the coherence of budget measures relating to the decarbonisation of transport, and could ask whether there's any measures that you would feel that the government, you'd like to see us recommending to the government when it comes to fiscal measures and the decarbonisation of transport?
So I think it is, we did see an increase in vehicle duty for petrol and diesel cars. That clearly helps with the incentives. It helps with this demand point that the industry understandably have been pointing to. I'm sure they would have preferred subsidies to taxes because they care about overall demand as well as demand for electric vehicles, but it does shift the demand there. The government made decisions around fuel duty. But what our focus has been, if you like, on the other side of that, is saying, well, look, actually, if we rebalance these electricity prices, the cost of running your electric vehicle, sorry, I know I've mentioned this about 30 times now, but it affects the cost of running the electric vehicle as well as the heat pump as well as industries. It's why it's so important to us, actually, because it operates across so much of the emissions landscape. And there's always a choice in fiscal things about which way you use your instruments, but what matters for the consumer is, am I better off or not? And you can achieve that in more than one way. It wouldn't be for us to tell the government which way to achieve it. But it certainly makes the case for the electricity side of things.
Thanks. I've got a couple of questions. The first one, I suppose, following on a bit from the comment about inclusion of aviation and shipping, it's just recognising that the UK's made relatively good progress in reducing territorial emissions, but much less good progress in reducing consumption-based emissions. Should we be thinking about the implications of that for how we're setting carbon budgets and how we're measuring our progress? And just wondering, as kind of technology improves and we're moving towards carbon border adjustment mechanisms and things like this, being able to recognise consumption-based emissions more easily, although recognising your report says there's quite a lot of flexibility in the figures. Can you just comment really on the importance of recognising the difference between consumption-based and territorial emissions and how we should take account of that better in policy?
Yeah, so perhaps I'll talk about that to begin with. So in fact, trying to set targets for consumption emissions isn't within the remit of our committee directly. If you do go back to the Climate Change Act, it's explicitly about territorial, but that doesn't mean that we don't care about consumption emissions. So it is something that we report on, and in fact there are people in my own university that do produce those consumption emissions for the government, and we report on them, and when we publish our net carbon budget advice, we in fact go into quite a lot of detail about where they come from, but important part of the consumption of emissions, because these are the ones that we import from other countries, and if you have a look at where they come from, the bulk of them come from EU countries, which is our biggest import market, and quite a lot of them come from food. So in fact, if you have a look at the trajectory, we in fact think, because our EU colleagues are also working to this net zero target, and they have quite a similar decarbonisation pathway that we have for our country, that in fact over time we can be a bit more confident that they should rapidly decline, but that is something we're very much keeping tabs on though.
Okay. Yeah, if I can just follow up on that, because actually you in your report you talk about consumption emissions. You actually say it's at figure 1.7. It's not. It's at figure 1.9.
Not mine.
That's the correction that needs to be made on page 82. But the key thing here is you say the latest consumption emissions data saw a large uptick, in part due to increased non-EU imports. Unilateral measures such as the CBAM, that's the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, will be most effective if paired with assistance and financing to help trade partners decarbonise, along with other multilateral partnerships. This would bring climate benefits beyond what's possible. And I think it's really important that you emphasise this here, but it's something that the government has not, I think, sufficiently emphasised. And I wondered whether you thought that this should be a recommendation of this committee, because, as you point out, there are wider benefits in terms of hypothecating the revenues from CBAM to our international aid programme, so that other countries can actually leapfrog their technologies, producing less emissions. And without that, the CBAM can actually just become a trade barrier that other countries see as another climate injustice by the global north on the global south.
Perhaps I will. I'm certainly not going to the details of what are the best policies for international trade, because it's outside of our job, and I'm also not an expert. But just in terms of that, we think things like carbon border adjustment do have a certain role, but they're not necessarily the most efficient way to really drive emission reductions and especially try and kind of support other countries to decarbonise. There are other approaches to consider, and these are things like very high quality standards. I'm sorry, I couldn't say that, never mind. They're very high quality standards that can really kind of support international countries to come together to really reduce their emissions over time, and those sort of approaches will probably ultimately be more efficient than something like a carbon border adjustment mechanism. But there are particular examples where you might want to employ it, and some like agriculture, because if you're going to ask our own farming community to change, the last thing you want to do with that is try and import not very good quality, very high carbon products.
Yeah. Thank you.
What you say, economist.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've probably covered most of it. If I think about, say, a country like South Africa, you've got a kind of high carbon legacy electricity infrastructure in that country. You know, we can help, partly because we have big financial markets, these are big financial investments, it's a lot of expertise, that country to decarbonise its whole economy. And of course then the CBAM doesn't then impact them, and you've done good things for the climate, and it's good for the economy of a country that we have close links with. So there is a kind of real win here. Of course, there's a lot of complexity within that. I mean, I don't want to say, well, it's all magic, it's simple, but you know, there is a real opportunity here if you can make that work.
Over the course of your session, we've reflected, broadly positive sense of direction, some areas that we want to see faster progress on, talking about on that current trajectory, some of the challenges that might exist in terms of continuing as we go forward. Obviously, when the policies of the government changes, that may change some of those things. And one of the things this committee is very interested in is the changes to the planning framework and the house building targets, which not only see substantial increases in the amount of house building, but also move away from it being largely sort of London city-based and anticipating more house building in areas that maybe haven't seen that level of house building growth in the past, and maybe less dense. Obviously, it will depend what decisions get made in terms of transport, in terms of how much of in terms of energy supplies to those houses and others. But I just wondered if you had any assessment on the basis of where the government is going on those targets, house building targets, and the planning framework, as to whether that's likely to, in the future, change in any significant way our progress on the current trajectory.
I think I would say the main thing, we talked about this earlier, is to ensure that those properties are not connected to the gas grid.
Yeah. Because
that's the biggest source of emissions within the home, and also of air pollution within the home. So if we can get that right, then that is the most important thing. We haven't specifically looked at a lot of the details, and some of that kind of gets beyond our remit. But we do assume in our modelling of the building sector, we do assume house building targets, but we don't have a kind of micro geographic capacity to kind of look at that. But yeah, I think it is predominantly around that the gas grid. I think the other thing obviously would then be, particularly if you have more dispersed communities around electric vehicle charging, because they are probably going to be a predominantly car-driven transport mode if places are more sparsely populated. That's, from an emissions perspective, an electric car powered by a wind turbine or another zero carbon source is emissions neutral. But you've got to get that charging infrastructure in there so that people who are buying those homes can feel comfortable to get an electric car to go with them.
And perhaps the other thing I'll very quickly add to that is that they do have to be properly insulated, of course, very high standard, and they have to be well adapted to whatever the future climate we might expect. They have to be built in the right part of the country where they won't go under water, and they have to be resilient to heat waves.
Yeah. Final question, Sarah Gibson.
Just going back to the housing issue, is that talking about building more in rural communities, and you're saying, well, so long as they've got electric cars, it's fine for them all to travel on their own in an electric car. I find that incredibly worrying, because is the committee really looking at full lifetime carbon footprints of these things? Because yes, the emissions, if it's fully renewable, of your electric vehicle are lower, or at the moment, and with an aspiration to being zero, but the carbon footprint of manufacturing all those electric cars, where they could be in more urban areas or better connected by public transport or walking or cycling, which is not the case if we're building in those rural communities and you're expecting everyone to drive. Surely, as a whole carbon reduction programme, if we're looking globally, the manufacture of those huge numbers of electric vehicles required, it cannot be the right answer.
So it's a really important point you raise, but my sense on this is that, of course, the manufacturing emissions depend on whether I have the car, not how far I drive the car. So in order to avoid people having cars, you would have to be building those properties much more in the densest of places where people might not have a car at all. So yes, if you put all of that building into, inner London, you might stop people buying a car. But actually, if you're building it in a town or in a rural area or even in a suburb of London, you're probably not changing the number of cars by very much. You may be changing, what you're changing is the distance travelled, and it's the distance travelled that's affected by that drivetrain and the turbine that's driving it rather than the gas power station. So that's why I'm doing the maths that way around.
Okay, I was going to say that if you come and spend some time in a rural community outside of the M25, the biggest difference in terms of connected cities and connected small towns is the second car. If you don't provide good public transport and good access to towns, then what happens is people buy a second vehicle. And I think that's perhaps the bit you're missing, is that no, they don't actually have to all therefore live in inner London. There is an option, but you will provoke people into buying a second car if we're not careful.
Perhaps I will chip in on kind of what we do as a committee. So we absolutely do have a look at options for transport within the rural communities that are low carbon, and we have a look at them quite carefully. In fact, one of our professors again does the work for our committee. It's not necessarily good. Greg Marston at the University of Leeds has done some really good work for us. In fact, just trying to understand exactly both the challenges and the opportunities that come from the kind of rural community work, and that does really feed into the analysis that we are going to be kind of providing.
Professor Forster, Dr. Richardson, thank you very much for your evidence. Thank you for all the time you've spent with us and for appearing in front of the committee. Thank you also to the committee. Order.